Sometimes when life strips everything away, it leaves behind exactly what you need to find yourself again. Ben Walker thought he'd lost it all. His marriage, his career, his sense of purpose, until he inherited his grandfather's forgotten cabin. Deep in the woods, everyone called him foolish for taking his 8-year-old daughter to live in what looked like a rotting shack. His ex-wife laughed. His co-workers shook their heads in pity. But when Ben stepped through that creaking door, he found carved blueprints, mysterious journals, and strange inventions that revealed his grandfather had been hiding an extraordinary secret. The old man wasn't just a hermit. He was a genius whose work could heal people in ways that seemed impossible. What discovery inside that cabin would transform not just Ben and his daughter, but an entire community? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive up the winding mountain road took 3 hours longer than it should have, mostly because Ben had to stop every 20 minutes to check the directions his grandfather's lawyer had scrawled on the back of an envelope. The GPS had given up 2 hours ago, leaving them with nothing but faded road signs, and Ben's growing certainty that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. "Daddy, are we lost?" Layla asked from the back seat, her voice cutting through the silence that had settled between them like dust on old furniture. Ben glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter's earnest face. Those dark eyes that reminded him so much of her mother, it sometimes took his breath away. "No, sweetheart, we're just taking the scenic route." It wasn't entirely a lie. The mountains were beautiful, even through the haze of his exhaustion and doubt. Pine trees stretched toward a sky so blue it seemed painted, and the air that drifted through his half-open window carried the scent of wildflowers and something else, something clean and untouched that made him remember being 8 years old himself, before life had taught him that dreams were just another word for disappointment. This inheritance letter lay crumpled on the passenger seat, its formal language still echoing in his mind. To Benjamin Walker, "I leave my property at Cedar Ridge, including all structures and contents therein." His grandfather had been dead for 6 months before anyone thought to track down his only remaining family. 6 months during which Ben's marriage had finally collapsed. His architectural firm had let him go due to restructuring, and his savings had dwindled to the point where he'd been considering moving back in with his parents. Then the letter arrived, along with a key tied to a piece of twine and a note in his grandfather's careful handwriting, "For when you need a place to remember who you are." Ben hadn't seen his grandfather since he was 12. The old man had been a figure from family. Stories. The uncle who'd gone strange after the war, who disappeared into the mountains and spoke to no one for decades. Ben's father had always spoken of him with a mixture of pity and embarrassment, the kind of tone people reserved for relatives who'd given up on normal life. But normal life hadn't been working out so well for Ben lately. The cabin appeared around, a bend in the road like something from a fever dream, if it could even be called a cabin anymore. The structure sagged against itself as if it were tired of standing, its roof thick with moss and missing shingles that lay scattered in the tall grass like broken teeth. One side of the porch had collapsed entirely, and what remained of the windows were either cracked or boarded over with warped plywood. Ben pulled the car to a stop in what might once have been a driveway and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have weight. "Is this it?" Lila whispered, as if speaking too loud might cause the whole structure to finally give up and collapse. "This is it," Ben said, though he could barely believe it. Himself. This was what his co-workers had laughed about, what Sarah had called chasing ghosts in the woods. This pile of rotting timber was supposed to be his fresh start, his chance to figure out his next move without the constant pressure of bills and expectations and the hollow echo of his failed marriage. They sat in the car for a long moment, both staring at the wreckage of what had once been someone's home. Ben found himself thinking about his grandfather as he'd last seen him, a tall, quiet man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to be looking at something just beyond what everyone else could see. He'd given Ben a carved wooden horse that Christmas whittled from what looked like driftwood, smooth and perfect in a way that spoke of countless hours of patient work. Ben still had that horse, packed away in a box somewhere in his storage unit back in the city. "It looks sad," Lila said finally, and Ben realized she was right. The cabin didn't look abandoned so much as forgotten, like an old person waiting for someone to visit who never came. "Maybe we can help it feel better," Ben heard himself say, though he had no idea where the words came from. They climbed out of the car, their footsteps loud on the gravel. The air was thinner up here, and cleaner than anything Ben had breathed in years. It carried the scent of pine and earth and something else, something that reminded him of his grandmother's attic, full of old books and cedar chests and memories. Stored away for safekeeping, the front door hung crooked on its hinges, the wood weathered to the color of old bones. Ben tried the key his grandfather's lawyer had given him, surprised when it turned easily in the lock. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the trees. Inside, shafts of sunlight slanted through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust and revealing a single room that seemed frozen in time. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and dark. Simple furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, sat arranged as if their owner had just stepped out for a moment and might return at any time. But it was what Ben didn't see that struck him most. No television, no computer, no signs of the connected, hurried world he'd left behind. Just books, hundreds of them, lining shelves that had been built into every available wall space. And something else, something that made him pause in the doorway. The place felt alive, not haunted. Ben had never believed in ghosts, but alive in the way that some houses felt loved, even when they were empty, as if the walls themselves remembered. Laughter and conversation, and the daily rhythms of a life well lived. "Daddy, look!" Lila called from across the room. She was kneeling beside the fireplace, running her small fingers along the stone. "There are pictures carved in here." Ben joined her, squinting in the dim light. She was right. Someone had carved intricate designs into the stones surrounding the hearth. Not just decorative patterns, but what looked like technical drawings, gears and pulleys, springs and levers, all rendered with the precision of an engineer's blueprint, but the artistry of a master craftsman. "Grandpa Great was an artist," Lila said, using the name she'd invented for the grandfather she'd never met. "He was something," Ben agreed, running his own fingers over the carvings. The detail was extraordinary. Whoever had done this work had understood machinery in a way that went far beyond hobby tinkering. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, though there wasn't much to see. The cabin was larger than it looked from outside, with a small loft accessible by a ladder built into the wall, and a root cellar that still smelled of preserved vegetables and earth. Everything was simple, functional, built to last, but everywhere. Ben looked. He found small touches that spoke of a mind that saw the world differently, door hinges that moved without sound, windows weighted with counterbalances that made them glide like silk, joints and connections that showed someone had cared deeply about how things worked. As evening approached, they made their way back to the main room. Ben was considering whether they should drive back down the mountain to find a motel when Lila called out again. "Daddy, the floor moves here." She was standing near the back wall, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Ben joined her and felt it too, a slight give in the floorboards, as if something underneath wasn't quite solid. Kneeling, he ran his hands along the wood until he found what he was looking for. A section where the boards were cut slightly shorter than the others, leaving a gap just wide enough for fingertips. He pried gently, and a section of flooring lifted away to reveal a space beneath. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected it from decades of moisture, was a book. Ben lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The leather cover was unmarked except for his grandfather's initials pressed into the lower right corner. Inside, the pages were filled with the same careful handwriting Ben remembered from the note that had come with the key. But these weren't letters or personal thoughts. They were plans, page after page of detailed drawings, measurements, calculations, and notes written in a precise hand that suggested years of engineering training. Mechanical devices Ben couldn't begin to understand, built around principles that seemed to bend the rules of physics he remembered from school. And on the first page, in his grandfather's careful script for healing what the world breaks, Ben looked up to find Lila watching him with eyes that seemed far older than her 8 years. "What did Grandpa Great make, Daddy?" Ben stared down at the journal in his hands, at drawings that suggested his grandfather had been far more than the simple hermit everyone had believed him to be. The devices sketched on these pages weren't just mechanical, they were purposeful, designed with an intention that went beyond mere function. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the cabin in shades of gold and amber. For the first time since the divorce, since losing his job, since everything had started falling apart, Ben felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said, closing the journal carefully, "but I think we're going to find out." The next morning brought the kind of mountain sunshine that made everything look possible. Ben woke on the narrow bed with a crick in his neck, and Lila curled against his side like a cat, her breath warm against his shoulder. For a moment, in that space between sleep and waking, he forgot where they were. Then the scent of pine and aged wood brought it all back, along with the memory of his grandfather's journal and its cryptic promise about healing what the world breaks. They'd stayed up past midnight reading through the pages by flashlight, Lila tracing the intricate drawings with her finger, while Ben tried to make sense of measurements and notes that seemed to reference materials and processes he'd never heard of. Some of the devices looked almost familiar, clockwork mechanisms he might have expected from a skilled craftsman. Others defied easy categorization, incorporating elements that seemed more like art than engineering. Now, in the clear light of day, Ben was ready to start making sense of what they'd inherited. "First things first," he told Lila over a breakfast, of granola bars and warm water from their thermos. "We need to make this place livable. Then we can figure out what your great-grandfather was really up to." Lila nodded solemnly, as if she understood the magnitude of the task ahead. She'd always been an unusually serious child, more comfortable with adult conversation than playground chatter. Sarah used to worry about it, pushing for more playdates and social activities. But Ben had recognized something in his daughter that reminded him of himself at that age, a mind that worked differently, that found wonder in how things fit together rather than in the noise and chaos that seemed to delight other children. They spent the morning taking inventory. The cabin was more solid than it appeared from outside, built with the kind of old-growth timber that didn't exist anymore. The foundation was stone, fitted so precisely that even after decades of weather, there were no gaps or shifts. Someone had known what they were doing when they'd built this place. The real problems were cosmetic but urgent: the missing roof shingles, the broken windows, the collapsed section of porch. Ben had brought basic tools, enough to handle simple repairs, but this would require more. He was making a mental list of what they'd need from the hardware store in town when the accident happened. He was trying to clear a section of the porch where fallen timber had created a hazardous pile. The wood was heavier than it looked, waterlogged, and twisted from years of weather. Ben got a good grip on what appeared to be an old beam, and lifted, putting his back into it. The wood splintered without warning, sending a jagged piece flying upward. Ben jerked backward, but not quickly enough. The sharp end caught him across the forearm, tearing through his shirt and laying open a gash that ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow. Blood welled immediately, darker than he'd expected, and flowing, more freely than seemed right for what should have been a superficial cut. Ben pressed his other hand against the wound, but crimson leaked between his fingers, dripping onto the weathered porch boards. "Daddy!" Lila's voice was sharp with alarm. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just a scratch." But even as he said it, Ben could feel the lie in the words. This was more than a scratch. The cut was deep, probably needed stitches, and they were 3 hours from the nearest hospital. Lila disappeared into the cabin and returned a moment later with one of the clean towels they'd brought. Ben pressed it against the wound, watching red spread through the white cotton like spilled wine. "We need to get to town," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Find a doctor or—" "Wait," Lila said. She was staring at his arm with that serious expression she got when she was working through a problem. "Grandpa Great was a healer, right? Maybe he left medicine." Ben wanted to argue, to explain that whatever homemade remedies his grandfather might have concocted wouldn't be enough for something like this. But the bleeding wasn't slowing, and the nearest medical help was a long drive down a winding mountain road. "Check the kitchen," he said. "Look for a first aid kit, anything marked for medical use." Lila ran back inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Ben sat heavily on the porch steps, pressing the towel harder against his arm and trying not to think about how much blood he was losing. The cut burned like fire, and he could feel his heart beating in the wounded flesh. "Found something!" Lila called from inside. She emerged carrying a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, its surface worn smooth by handling. Carved into the lid was the same symbol Ben had noticed among the fireplace carvings, a circle containing what looked like a gear mechanism, but with organic curves that made it seem almost alive. Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, were dozens of small jars and bottles, each labeled in his grandfather's careful handwriting: willow bark extract, comfrey root, calendula oil, and others with names Ben didn't recognize, written in what might have been Latin or some other language entirely. "This one," Lila said, pointing to a jar near the center of the collection. The label read simply, "For wounds that weep." Ben wanted to protest, to insist they needed real medical attention, not folk remedies from a man who'd lived alone in the woods for decades. But the towel was soaked through now, and he could feel a lightheadedness creeping in at the edges of his vision. "All right," he said, "but if this doesn't work, we're driving to town immediately." Lila unscrewed the lid of the jar, revealing a pale green salve that smelled of herbs and something else, something clean and sharp that made the air around them seem suddenly more alive. She dipped her finger into the mixture, then hesitated. "I don't want to hurt you, Daddy." "You won't," Ben said, though he had no idea if that was true. "Go ahead." She spread the salve gently along the length of the cut, her touch feather-light but thorough. The moment the mixture touched his skin, Ben felt a sensation unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Not quite warmth, not quite cold, but something that seemed to reach deeper than nerve endings, as if the salve were communicating directly with his body at a cellular level. The burning stopped immediately. Ben stared down at his arm, expecting to see the wound still gaping and bloody. Instead, the cut had sealed itself, leaving only a thin red line that even as he watched was fading to pink, then to nothing at all. The skin was smooth and unmarked, as if he'd never been injured at all. He flexed his arm experimentally. No pain, no stiffness. Nothing to indicate that moments before he'd been bleeding heavily from a gash that should have required emergency medical attention. "How is that possible?" he whispered. Lila was examining the jar with the intensity of a scientist studying a new discovery. The label says, "For wounds that weep," but there's more writing on the bottom, really tiny writing. She held the jar up to the light, squinting at the base. It says, "Pain shared is pain halved. Pain healed is joy doubled." Ben took the jar from her, turning it in his hands. The salve looked ordinary enough, the kind of herbal remedy that might be sold at a farmer's market or health food store. But what had just happened defied every law of medicine and biology he understood. "Lila, you can't tell anyone about this," he said finally. "Not your mother, not anyone at school when we get back. This has to stay between us until we figure out what it means." She nodded gravely. "Because they wouldn't believe us. Because they'd want to take it away," Ben corrected. "And I don't. I think that's what your great-grandfather would have wanted." They sat together on the porch steps, passing the jar between them and trying to process what they'd witnessed. Ben found himself thinking about the journal, about those careful drawings of devices meant to heal what the world breaks. If his grandfather had been capable of creating something like this salve, what else might be hidden in the cabin? And more. Importantly, why had he hidden it at all? The answer came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. His grandfather hadn't been a hermit because he'd given up on the world. He'd been protecting something. Knowledge that others might misuse, discoveries that were too important to trust to institutions or governments or anyone who might see profit instead of purpose. But why leave it to Ben, a man who'd failed at marriage, failed at his career, failed at almost everything he'd tried to build, unless his grandfather had seen something in him that Ben couldn't see in himself, something worth inheriting. As the sun climbed higher, warming the mountain air and bringing the forest around them to life with birdsong and rustling leaves, Ben made a decision that would change everything. They weren't going back to the city. Not yet. Whatever secrets his grandfather had left behind, whatever healing knowledge was hidden in this forgotten place, Ben was going to find it. For Leela, who deserved to know the full extent of her family's legacy, for his grandfather, who had trusted him with something precious, and maybe, if he was honest with himself, for his own wounded soul that needed healing as much as his arm. Had the jar of salve sat between them, innocuous and impossible, containing mysteries that would take more than a summer to unravel. Over the next 3 days, Ben and Lila fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. They woke with the sun, worked through the morning coolness, and spent the hottest part of each day exploring the cabin's secrets. What had seemed like a simple one-room structure revealed itself to be far more complex, with hidden storage spaces and cleverly concealed compartments built into nearly every surface. It was Lila who found the workshop she'd been investigating, what appeared to be a solid wall behind the stone fireplace, running her hands along the stones the way she'd seen Ben check for loose floorboards. Her small fingers found a depression in one of the carved symbols, and when she pressed it, an entire section of the wall swung inward on silent hinges. "Daddy!" she called, her voice echoing strangely. "You need to see this." Ben dropped the hammer he'd been using to repair the porch and hurried inside. Leela stood in front of an opening that definitely hadn't been there moments before. Cool air flowing out of what appeared to be a cave carved directly into the mountainside. "How did you—" he began, but Lila was already stepping through the opening, her natural curiosity overcoming any sense of caution. The space beyond was larger than the cabin itself, carved from living rock with the same precision that had gone into every other aspect of the property. But where the cabin was simple and functional, this hidden workshop was a marvel of organized complexity. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces covered with tools that looked both ancient and impossibly sophisticated. Some Ben recognized: hammers and chisels, measuring devices, lathes for turning wood and metal. Others defied classification, their purpose unclear but their craftsmanship undeniable. Everything was arranged with mathematical precision, as if each tool had its exact place in some larger design. But it was what occupied the center of the room that made Ben's breath catch in his throat. On a table of dark wood polished to mirror, brightness sat a device unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was roughly the size of a human heart, crafted from what looked like brass and copper, with intricate gears and mechanisms visible through panels of clear crystal. As they approached, the device began to emit a soft, rhythmic sound, not quite mechanical, not quite organic, but something that seemed to bridge the gap between the two. "It's alive," Lila whispered, and Ben couldn't bring himself to disagree. The mechanical heart, for that's what it undeniably was, pulsed with a gentle light that grew brighter as Lila drew near. When she reached out to touch it, the rhythm quickened, as if responding to her presence. The light shifted from warm amber to soft blue, and the sound it made took on an almost musical quality. "Don't touch," Ben started, but Lila's fingertips were already resting on the device's smooth surface. The moment contact was made, the workshop filled with a sound like distant bells. Light spread from the mechanical heart through what Ben now realized was a network of crystal conduits running along the walls and ceiling, illuminating the space with a warm, living glow. And in that light, Ben saw things he'd missed in the shadows. The walls weren't just carved stone, they were covered with diagrams, equations, and notes written in multiple languages. English, Latin, what might have been German or Russian, and symbols that looked older than any language Ben knew. But somehow, perhaps because of the light or perhaps because of something else entirely, he found he could understand them. They were instructions, blueprints, a manual for devices that could read human emotion and respond accordingly. Emotional resonance amplifier, he read aloud from one of the wall inscriptions, for the treatment of spiritual wounds and the restoration of empathetic connection. Lila kept her hand on the mechanical heart, her eyes wide with wonder as the light continued to flow through the crystal network. It's not just alive, Daddy, it's happy. It's been waiting for someone to find it. Ben wanted to dismiss her words as imagination, the kind of anthropomorphizing that children did naturally. But the evidence was right in front of him. The device was responding to human presence, to human touch, in ways that no mere machine could. Whatever his grandfather had created here, it operated on principles that conventional science couldn't explain. They spent hours in the workshop, cataloging devices and trying to understand their purposes. Some were clearly medical instruments for measuring pulse and breathing, devices that seemed designed to analyze blood or other bodily fluids. Others were more mysterious, their function hinted at by the wall diagrams, but not immediately obvious. It was late afternoon when they heard the knock on the cabin door. Ben tensed immediately. They'd seen no one since arriving. Hadn't even seen evidence that anyone else lived within miles of the place. He motioned for Lila to stay in the workshop while he went to investigate. Through the front window, he could see an elderly woman standing on the repaired section of porch, a basket in one hand and a walking stick in the other. She was small and weathered, with silver hair pinned back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Ben opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, and her whole face transformed. "You must be Ben. You have your grandfather's eyes, though you're taller than he was. I'm Martha Henley. I live about 2 miles down the mountain, and I thought you might appreciate some proper food." She held up the basket, from which emerged the scents of fresh bread and something that might have been soup. Ben's stomach rumbled in response, reminding him that they'd been living on granola bars and canned goods for 3 days. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Henley, but Martha," she corrected, "and it's not kindness, it's selfishness. I've been curious about William's grandson since I heard you'd inherited the place. Mind if I come in? These old bones don't care much for standing." Before Ben could object, she was stepping through the door, her sharp eyes taking in the cabin's interior with an attention to detail that suggested this wasn't her first visit. "You've been busy," she observed, noting the repairs and the general sense of order they'd brought to the space. "William would be pleased. He always said this place needed a family again. You knew my grandfather well." Martha set her basket on the table and began unpacking containers of food that looked and smelled like they'd come from a professional kitchen. "Knew him? Child, I was probably the only person who really knew him. We were friends for 37 years, right up until the day he died." The casual way she said it made Ben realize something he should have asked earlier. "How did he die? The lawyer didn't give me any details." "Peacefully, in his sleep, just the way he would have wanted." Martha paused in her unpacking, her expression growing more serious. "But that's not what you're really asking, is it? You want to know about the work, about what he left you." Ben felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "I don't know what you mean." Martha laughed, a sound both kind and knowing. Ben Walker, your grandfather spent the last 40 years of his life developing technologies that could revolutionize medicine, psychology, and human understanding itself. Did you really think he'd leave all that to someone who wasn't meant to continue his work? Daddy! Lila appeared in the doorway, having apparently decided that the visitor posed no threat. Is this the lady who helped Grandpa great? Martha's eyes widened as she took in Lila's serious expression and the way the child seemed to look right through her. Well, hello there, little one. And yes, I did help your great-grandfather, just like I'm going to help you and your daddy understand what he left for you. She moved to the fireplace, running her fingers along one of the carved symbols in a pattern that seemed both random and deliberate. The hidden door swung open, revealing the workshop beyond, with its network of glowing crystals still pulsing with warm light. He's been down there, hasn't he? Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. The workshop has been dark for 6 months. I was beginning to wonder if the devices would remember how to wake up. Ben stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. You knew about all this? I helped him build half of it, Martha replied matter-of-factly. Who do you think provided the organic components for his synthesis work? The botanical knowledge for his healing compounds? William was a genius with mechanisms and energy, but he needed someone who understood the biological side of healing. She moved toward the workshop entrance, then paused to look back at them. Your grandfather didn't retreat to these mountains because he'd given up on the world, Ben. He came here because he'd found something the world wasn't ready for, something that had to be protected until the right person could inherit it. And you think I'm the right person? Martha's smile was gentle but assured. You healed a wound that should have required surgery using a salve that's been sitting in that medicine box for 6 months. The fact that it still worked, that it recognized your need and responded accordingly, tells me everything I need to know about your compatibility with William's work. She stepped into the workshop, her movements sure and familiar. Now come, along, both of you. It's time you learned what you've really inherited and what it's going to cost you to keep it. Martha moved through the workshop like someone returning to a familiar room after a long absence. She touched devices with casual familiarity, adjusting settings and checking connections with the efficiency of long practice. Under her ministrations, additional crystal networks came alive, bathing the space in layers of colored light that seemed to pulse in harmony with the mechanical heart. Your grandfather called this the empathy engine, she said, gesturing to the heart-like device that still responded to Lila's proximity. It was his first breakthrough, the foundation for everything else he built. It reads emotional states through bioelectric fields and converts negative emotional energy into healing frequencies. Ben watched as she activated what looked like a control panel carved directly into the stone wall. Symbols he couldn't read began to glow in sequence, and the sound of the workshop changed, becoming richer and more complex, like an orchestra tuning before a performance. I still don't understand how any of this is possible, Ben said. You're talking about technologies that shouldn't exist, that go against everything I know about physics and biology. Martha pulled a device from one of the workbenches, a crystalline lens about the size of a dinner plate, set in a frame of the same brass and copper material as the mechanical heart. William used to say that the problem with modern science wasn't that it was wrong, but that it was incomplete, that there were entire fields of natural law that we'd forgotten how to see. She held the lens up to catch the light from the crystal network, and suddenly the workshop was filled with something that made Ben's breath catch. Images, translucent and shimmering, moving through the air like projected memories. He saw his grandfather as a younger man, working at the very bench where the mechanical heart now sat. But in the image, the device was incomplete. Its crystal, panels dark and its gears motionless. The younger William Walker bent over it with the intensity of a man trying to solve the most important puzzle of his life. The memory glass, Martha explained, adjusting the lens to bring the images into sharper focus. It stores emotional imprints left behind in places where strong feelings were experienced. Your grandfather spent months perfecting the resonance. Frequency needed to make the empathy engine respond to human emotion, rather than just mechanical input. The image shifted, showing William's face lighting up with joy as the device pulsed to life for the first time. Ben could see tears on his grandfather's cheeks, and somehow, through the strange magic of the memory glass, he could feel an echo of that moment, the triumph of breakthrough, the relief of success after countless failures. "Why emotional energy?" Ben asked. "What made him think that was the key?" Martha lowered the lens, and the images faded back into the crystal light. "Because emotional energy is the one thing modern medicine can't measure or quantify, even though every doctor knows it affects healing. Your grandfather believed that emotions weren't just chemical reactions in the brain. They were expressions of fundamental forces that shaped reality at a quantum level." She moved to another workbench, this one holding devices that looked more recognizably medical. Instruments for measuring vital signs, containers that might have held medicines, tools that seemed designed for precise surgical work. "He started with simple observation," Martha continued, "measuring the bioelectric fields around people experiencing different emotional states, documenting how those fields changed when people were in pain versus when they were content. What he discovered was that emotional states create measurable disturbances in what he called the empathic field, a network of energy that connects all living things." Lila had been quiet through this explanation, her hand still resting on the empathy engine, but now she spoke up. "It's like how I can tell when you're sad, Daddy, even when you pretend you're not." Ben looked at his daughter, remembering all the times she'd seemed to sense his moods before he'd even acknowledged them himself. "Yes, sweetheart, exactly like that. Most children are naturally sensitive to the empathic field," Martha explained. "But adults learn to ignore it, to trust only what their physical senses tell them. Your grandfather never lost that sensitivity, and apparently neither has Lila." She activated another device, this one producing a sound like wind chimes played by a gentle breeze. The empathy engine's rhythm shifted in response, and Ben felt something he hadn't experienced since before his divorce. A sense of peace that seemed to come from outside himself, as if the very air around them was infused with calm. "This is why you're here," Martha said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering news that would change everything. "Why William left all this to you instead of to a university or research institution. The devices don't just require someone who understands their mechanics. They require someone who can feel their purpose, someone whose own emotional wounds need healing." The truth of her words hit Ben like a physical blow. Every failure of the past year, every moment of despair and self-doubt suddenly seemed like preparation for this moment. His grandfather hadn't left him a burden. He'd left him exactly what he needed, when he needed it most. "The memory glass shows more than just the past," Martha continued, raising the lens again. "It can show you the emotional history of objects, places, even people. But be careful what you look for. Some memories are too painful to witness unprepared." This time, when the images appeared, Ben saw himself. Not as he was now, but as a child of perhaps 6 or 7, standing in this very workshop with wide eyes and an expression of absolute wonder. His grandfather knelt beside him, pointing out details of a device Ben couldn't quite see clearly, both of them laughing at some shared joke. "I was here before," Ben whispered. "I remember this place." "Your father brought you once, when you were very young," Martha confirmed. "William hoped that you might show the same affinity for the work that he had. But your father was afraid. Afraid of what people would think, afraid of what might happen if the wrong people learned about the devices." The memory shifted, showing Ben's father and grandfather in heated discussion, while young Ben played with what looked like a mechanical toy. Even without sound, the tension between the two men was clear. His father's gestures spoke of fear and frustration, while his grandfather's posture suggested disappointment and resignation. "That was the last time your father brought you here," Martha said softly. "He made William promise to keep all of this secret, to never contact your family." Again, William honored that promise, even though it broke his heart. The images faded, leaving Ben with a new understanding of the distance that had always existed between his father and his grandfather. It hadn't been indifference or family conflict, it had been fear. Fear of the very gifts that might have enriched all their lives. "Lila," Martha said, turning to address the child directly, "would you like to see what your great-grandfather saw when he looked at you?" Lila nodded solemnly, and Martha adjusted the memory glass to focus on the empathy engine itself. The image that appeared made Ben's heart clench with unexpected emotion. It was Lila, but not as she was now. This was Lila as his grandfather had imagined her, a grown woman working in the workshop, her hands sure and confident as she operated devices that hadn't been built yet. She was teaching someone, a younger person whose face Ben couldn't quite make out, passing on knowledge that spanned generations. "He saw the future," Ben breathed. "He saw possibility," Martha corrected. "The empathic field doesn't just connect us to each other. It connects us to all the potential futures that our choices might create." William saw that if the right person inherited his work, if they were willing to dedicate their lives to understanding and protecting it, the healing knowledge he'd developed could eventually transform how humanity deals with suffering. She lowered the memory glass and looked directly at Ben. But he also saw what would happen if the wrong people gained access to this technology. Governments that would weaponize empathic manipulation, corporations that would turn emotional healing into profit-driven therapy, individuals who would use the ability to read and influence emotions for personal gain. The weight of responsibility settled on Ben's shoulders like a physical thing. He was looking at technologies that could revolutionize human understanding of consciousness, emotion, and healing, but he was also looking at power that could be catastrophically misused. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" he asked. "I'm not a scientist or a doctor. I'm just an architect who lost his job and his family." Martha smiled, the expression both kind and knowing. "You're a man who brought his daughter to a place of healing because he recognized that they both needed it. You're someone who can see potential in broken things and imagine how to make them whole again. That's not just architecture, Ben. That's exactly the kind of vision this work requires." She moved to a final workbench, one that held a collection of small devices Ben hadn't noticed before. They looked like jewelry, pendants and bracelets and rings, but each one incorporated the same crystalline elements as the larger devices. William called these the connectors, Martha explained. "They're tuned to the same frequencies as the main devices, but they're portable. Someone wearing one would be linked to the empathic network no matter how far they traveled from the workshop." She picked up a pendant, its crystal center pulsing with soft light. He made dozens of them over the years, but he never distributed them. He was waiting for the right moment, the right person to decide who could be trusted with that kind of connection. Ben stared at the collection of connectors, understanding dawning slowly. He wasn't just building healing devices. He was building a network, a way to connect people who could use this technology responsibly. A community, Martha agreed. People who had been healed by the devices, who understood their power and their responsibility. William envisioned a time when emotional healing could be as accessible as physical medicine, when people suffering from trauma or depression or despair could find relief without drugs or invasive procedures. She handed the pendant to Ben, and the moment it touched his skin, he felt a change. The sense of peace that had been growing since they'd entered the workshop deepened, but more than that, he became aware of Lila's emotional state as clearly, as if she'd spoken aloud. her wonder, her excitement, her absolute trust that everything was going to be all right. And underneath it all, something else, a connection that seemed to stretch beyond the workshop, beyond the mountain, touching, briefly on points of light scattered across vast distances. Other people, other connectors, other hearts that beat in harmony with the empathic field his grandfather had learned to access. "There are others," Ben said, his voice filled with awe. 17 at last count, Martha confirmed. "People William helped over the years. People who proved themselves worthy of his trust. They've been waiting, Ben, waiting for the workshop to come alive again, waiting for someone to take up William's work." She gathered up several of the connectors, wrapping them carefully in soft cloth. "But first, you have to decide if you're ready for what that means. Because once you fully activate the network, once you begin using these devices to help people, there's no going back to the life you had before." Ben looked around the workshop, at the incredible legacy his grandfather had left him. Then he looked at Lila, still standing beside the empathy engine, with her hand on its crystalline surface, her face glowing with the reflected light of possibilities yet to be realized. For the first time since his divorce, since his world had fallen apart, Ben knew exactly what he was supposed to do with his life. The empathy engine had been running. For a week, when Ben first experienced what Martha called an emotional cascade, he'd been working in the workshop, trying to understand the principles behind a device that seemed designed to purify water using nothing but crystalline resonance, when a wave of profound sadness washed over him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't his sadness. That much was immediately clear. The emotion carried a different signature, flavored with experiences and memories that weren't his own. Through the pendant Martha had given him, he could sense the source, someone miles away, connected to the network, experiencing a grief so deep it had overwhelmed the empathic field's usual buffering mechanisms. "Martha," he called, and she appeared, and from the cabin above, with the speed of someone who'd been expecting this moment. "Feel it?" she asked, touching her own pendant and immediately drawing some of the overwhelming emotion into herself, lessening the burden on Ben's unprepared psyche. "Someone's in pain," Ben gasped, the words barely adequate to describe the intensity of what he was experiencing. Real pain, like they're dying inside. "Rebecca Morrison," Martha said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "She lives about 20 miles north, near the old logging road. Lost her husband 3 weeks ago in a car accident. William helped her through cancer 5 years back, gave her one of the connectors when she proved she could handle the responsibility." Through the empathic link, Ben could feel the woman's anguish, not just the fresh grief of loss, but the deeper despair that came from believing she was completely alone. It was a feeling he recognized intimately from his own darkest moments. "After the divorce, what do we do?" he asked. Martha was already gathering supplies from around the workshop, moving with the efficiency of long practice. "We do what William would have done. We go to her, and we help her remember that suffering shared is suffering diminished." She handed Ben a device he hadn't seen before, a crystalline sphere about the size of a baseball, suspended in a framework of the same brass and copper as the other inventions. "This is a portable version of the empathy engine. It can't do everything the main unit can, but it can provide temporary relief from acute emotional trauma." They drove to Rebecca Morrison's house in Martha's ancient pickup truck, the device humming softly between them as it responded to their proximity. Ben found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a failed architect, drowning in self-pity. Now he was racing through mountain roads to provide emotional healing to a stranger using technology that shouldn't exist. Rebecca's house was small and neat, the kind of place that spoke of lives lived simply but with care. Ben could see evidence of recent neglect, an overflowing mailbox, newspapers scattered on the porch, garden plants that were wilting from lack of attention. Through the empathic connection, he could feel the woman inside, her grief like a black hole that pulled everything into its emptiness. Martha knocked gently but persistently until the door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s, her eyes red from crying, and her entire posture speaking of defeat. "Martha?" Rebecca's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I know. I should have come to see you, but I just can't. I can't do anything right now." "I know, dear," Martha said, stepping forward to embrace the other woman. "That's why we came to you. Rebecca, this is Ben Walker, William's grandson. He's taken over the work." Rebecca's eyes focused on Ben with difficulty, as if seeing through a fog of pain. "William's grandson. But I thought the family didn't want anything to do with his research." "Sometimes what we think we know changes," Ben said softly, feeling the weight of her grief through the pendant around his neck. "May we come in? I think we might be able to help." Inside, the house told the story of a life interrupted, half finished. Meals sat on counters, laundry overflowed from baskets, and photographs of a silver-haired man with kind eyes watched from every surface. The empathic field was thick with accumulated sorrow, years of love suddenly severed and left with nowhere to go. Martha set the portable empathy engine on the coffee table, its crystalline surface immediately beginning to pulse with gentle light. The moment it activated, Ben felt the crushing weight of Rebecca's grief begin to ease slightly, as if the device were absorbing some of the raw emotional energy that had been consuming her. "I don't understand what's happening," Rebecca said, staring at the device. "I feel like I can breathe for the first time in weeks." "Grief isn't meant to be carried alone," Martha explained, adjusting the device's settings with practiced familiarity. "William discovered that emotional pain, like physical pain, serves a purpose. It alerts us to damage that needs healing. But just like physical pain, it becomes destructive when it's too intense or lasts too long." The device pulsed brighter, and Ben watched as some of the tension left Rebecca's shoulders. Through the empathic link, he could feel her emotional state shifting, not eliminating the grief, which would have been wrong, but tempering it enough that she could function. "I keep thinking I should be over it by now," Rebecca whispered. "Tom and I had 43 years together. I should be grateful for that, not falling apart because it's over." 43 years of love doesn't just disappear overnight," Ben said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "What you're feeling isn't weakness. It's proof of how deep that connection was. The pain is the other side of the love." As he spoke, Ben realized he was learning something about his own losses. His divorce hadn't just been the end of a marriage. It had been the severing of emotional connections that had shaped his identity for years. No wonder he'd felt so lost. Martha activated another setting on the device, and the quality of light in the room changed, becoming warmer and more golden. "This is something William developed later in his research," she explained. "Instead of just absorbing negative emotion, it can help transform it into something useful." Ben felt it immediately, a shift in the empathic field that turned Rebecca's raw grief into something deeper and more manageable. Not happiness, which would have been false, but a profound sense of gratitude for the love she'd experienced and a growing awareness that Tom's influence on her life hadn't ended with his death. "I can feel him," Rebecca said, her voice filled with wonder. "Not like he's here, but like the love we shared is still real, still part of who I am." "Love doesn't die when people do," Martha said gently. "It just changes form." William spent years studying the persistence of emotional connections, the way deep bonds leave permanent impressions on the empathic field. They stayed with Rebecca for 3 hours, adjusting the device's output and teaching her how to use the pendant William had given her to maintain the connection when they left. By the time they prepared to go, she was moving with purpose again, making plans to call her sister and tend to her neglected garden. "Thank you," she said to Ben as they stood at her door. "I don't know how this works, but I know it saved my life today." Driving back to the cabin, Ben found himself overwhelmed by what he'd witnessed. "How many people has this technology helped?" he asked Martha. "Over the years? Hundreds at least." William was very careful about who he approached. But word gets around when someone starts healing problems that conventional medicine can't touch. People with chronic depression, couples whose marriages were failing, children who'd experienced trauma, anyone whose emotional wounds were preventing them from living full lives. Ben thought about his own emotional wounds, the way his failures had compounded until he'd believed himself incapable of success at anything. Why didn't my grandfather ever reach out to me? When my marriage was falling apart, when I was losing everything, why didn't he offer to help? Martha was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because he'd promised your father he wouldn't interfere, and because he knew that you needed to come to this place ready to receive what he had to offer. If he'd approached you when you were still fighting to hold on to your old life, you never would have been able to let it transform you. Back at the cabin, Ben found Lila in the workshop, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the main empathy engine with a book in her lap. She looked up as they entered, her face glowing with excitement. "Daddy, I've been reading Grandpa Great's journals, and I figured out something amazing. The empathy engine isn't just for helping people who are sad. It can make happy feelings stronger too." She pointed to a section of text Ben had overlooked, written in his grandfather's careful handwriting. He says here that joy shared through the empathic field becomes amplified, just like how sadness gets diminished when it's shared. So if someone wearing a pendant is really happy, everyone connected to them feels happier too. Ben knelt beside his daughter, reading over her shoulder. The implications were staggering. Not just a technology for healing emotional wounds, but a way to amplify positive emotions across an entire network of connected people. "There's more," Lila continued, turning pages with the confidence of someone who'd been studying the material for hours. "Grandpa Great wrote about something he called the community connector. It's like the pendants, but bigger. It can link all the healing devices across long distances so people can help each other even when they're far apart." Martha knelt beside them, her expression growing serious. "William mentioned the community connector to me once, but I never saw the actual device. He said it was the most dangerous thing he'd ever built, and the most necessary." "Dangerous? How?" Ben asked. "Because it would create a permanent empathic network spanning hundreds of miles. Anyone wearing a pendant would be connected to everyone else, feeling their emotions, sharing their experiences. It could revolutionize human connection and cooperation, or it could be used to manipulate entire populations." Ben stared at the journal pages, understanding why his grandfather had been so careful about who he trusted with this knowledge. In the wrong hands, the ability to influence human emotion on a massive scale could be catastrophic. But in the right hands, in the hands of people who understood the responsibility that came with such power, it could heal divisions that had seemed permanent, create understanding where there had been only conflict. "Where is it?" he asked. "The community connector." Lila pointed to a diagram that showed the workshop in cross-section, revealing spaces Ben hadn't known existed. "According to this, it's down there, in a room below the workshop that can only be opened when the main empathy engine reaches full activation." As if responding to her words, the mechanical heart began to pulse more brightly, its rhythm quickening. Around the workshop, crystal networks that had been dormant began to glow with new light, and Ben felt the empathic field expanding, reaching out beyond the mountain to touch the 17 other people Martha had mentioned. Somewhere in the distance, he could sense other points of light. Rebecca Morrison, already feeling stronger from their visit, and others scattered across the region. People who had been helped by his grandfather over the years, people who were now part of a network dedicated to healing the emotional wounds that conventional medicine couldn't touch. But through that same network, Ben could feel something else: attention, interest, the growing awareness of others who had begun to sense the activation of power they'd long believed lost. Not everyone connected to the empathic field shared his grandfather's benevolent intentions. The inheritance his grandfather had left him was more complex and dangerous than he'd imagined. But as he looked at Lila, her face bright with excitement at the discoveries they were making, Ben knew there was no turning back. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever forces might try to claim or corrupt his grandfather's work, he would find a way to protect it. The healing these devices could provide was too important to lose to fear or greed. But first, he had to learn how to use them properly, and that meant activating the community connector, regardless of the risks. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday morning like a storm front, moving across clear skies, her rental car kicking up dust as it pulled into the cabin's makeshift driveway. Ben had been expecting this confrontation for weeks, ever since he'd stopped returning. Her increasingly frantic phone calls about when he and Lila would be coming home. Through the empathic pendant, he felt her emotional state long before she reached the door. A mixture of anger, fear, and underneath it all, genuine concern for Lila's well-being. It was the concern that made him open the door when she knocked, rather than pretending they weren't home. Ben. Sarah's voice was clipped, professional, the tone she used when she was trying to maintain control in a situation that felt chaotic. We need to talk. She looked exactly as he remembered, perfectly put together, even after a long drive, her blonde hair styled in a way that probably cost more than he'd spent on groceries in the past month. But through the pendant's enhanced perception, he could see past the composed exterior to the exhaustion and worry she was trying to hide. "Come in," Ben said, stepping aside. "Lila's down at the creek. She'll be excited to see you." Sarah entered the cabin, her sharp eyes taking in the changes they'd made over the past month. The space was unrecognizable from the derelict structure. They'd found clean, organized, warm, with afternoon sunlight streaming through new windows. More importantly, it felt lived in, loved, in a way their house in the city never had. "This is what you've been doing?" she asked, her tone suggesting she wasn't sure whether to be impressed or concerned. "Playing pioneer in the middle of nowhere?" "We've been learning," Ben said carefully, "about family, about history, about things that matter." Sarah's laugh had a sharp edge. "Things that matter. Ben, Lila is supposed to start 3rd grade in 3 weeks. She's missed her summer camp, her swimming lessons, her friends. And for what? So you can live out some fantasy about being connected. To nature?" Before Ben could answer, Lila burst through the door, her clothes muddy from creek exploration and her face bright with joy. "Mummy!" she squealed, launching herself into Sarah's arms. For a moment, Sarah's professional composure cracked, and Ben could feel the pure love she had for their daughter flowing through the empathic field. Whatever else had gone wrong between them, whatever anger and resentment had built up over the years, they both wanted what was best for Lila. "I've missed you so much, baby," Sarah whispered into Lila's hair. "Are you okay? Are you happy here?" "I'm more than happy," Lila said with the seriousness that always surprised adults. "Mommy, I've learned so many things. About Grandpa Great and how he helped people, and about the machines that can make sad people feel better." Sarah's eyes met Ben's over Lila's head, her expression shifting from relief to concern. "What machines, sweetheart?" Ben felt his stomach drop. They'd been so careful to frame their discoveries in terms Lila could understand, but they'd never discussed what she should and shouldn't share with others. "The ones in the secret room," Lila continued enthusiastically. "Daddy and Martha have been teaching me how they work. There's this one that looks like a heart, and when I touch it, it glows and makes everyone feel peaceful. And there are special necklaces that let people help each other, even when they're far away." Sarah set Lila down gently, her lawyer instincts clearly activated. "Ben, what is she talking about? What secret room?" Ben felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He could lie, deflect, try to minimize what they'd discovered. Or he could trust that the woman he'd once loved enough to marry might be capable of understanding something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. "Lila," he said, "would you mind getting some lemonade for your mom? I think she could use something cold after that long drive." Lila nodded and skipped toward the kitchen area, leaving Ben and Sarah alone. The empathic pendant around his neck pulsed with the intensity of emotions in the room. Sarah's growing alarm, his own uncertainty, and underneath it all, the steady presence of the devices in the workshop below, responding to the emotional disturbance above. "Sarah," Ben began, then stopped. "How did you explain the impossible to someone whose world was built on legal precedents and documented facts?" "Just show me," she said, her voice taking on the tone she used when she sensed that witnesses were holding back crucial information. "Whatever this is, whatever you've gotten yourself and our daughter involved in, I need to see it." Ben led her to the fireplace, his hand hovering over the carved symbol that would open the workshop. "Before I show you this, I need you to understand something. Everything you're about to see is real, but it's not something that fits into the world we thought we understood. And once you know about it, you'll be responsible for keeping it safe." "Ben, you're scaring me." "Good," he said, pressing the symbol. "Because what my grandfather left us is something that could change the world or destroy it if it falls into the wrong hands." The wall swung open, revealing the workshop with its network of glowing crystals and impossible devices. Sarah's reaction was immediate and visceral. She stepped backward, her hand moving instinctively to her phone as if she were considering calling for help. But then the empathy engine pulsed, responding to their presence, and Ben watched as Sarah's expression shifted from fear to wonder. Through the empathic field, he could feel her mind trying to process what she was seeing, her legal training warring with the evidence of her own senses. "This isn't possible," she whispered, but she was moving forward, drawn by the same curiosity that had always been one of her greatest strengths. "I know," Ben said, "but it's real anyway." Martha emerged from the depths of the workshop, where she'd been working on some maintenance task. She took in Sarah's shocked expression with the understanding of someone who'd witnessed many such revelations over the years. "You must be Sarah," Martha said warmly. "William always hoped that Ben would find someone who could share the responsibility of his legacy. I see why he chose you. Even in shock, you're evaluating, analyzing, trying to understand." "This is Martha Henley," Ben explained. "She worked with my grandfather for 37 years. She's the one who's been teaching us how everything works." Sarah looked around the workshop, her sharp mind clearly cataloging details. "These devices, they're what Lila was talking about. They actually work." In response, Martha activated the portable empathy engine they'd used with Rebecca Morrison. The moment it came online, Sarah gasped, her hand moving to her chest. "I can feel it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "It's like someone turned down the volume on all the anxiety I didn't even realize I was carrying." "That's exactly what it does," Martha explained. Among other things, William spent 40 years developing technologies that could read, influence, and heal human emotional states. What you're experiencing is just the beginning. For the next hour, Martha and Ben walked Sarah through the workshop, explaining the purpose and function of each device. They showed her the memory glass, letting her witness scenes from William's life and work. They demonstrated the pendant network, allowing her to feel the empathic connections that linked them to people across the region. Sarah's response shifted from skepticism to fascination to growing alarm as she began to understand the implications of what she was seeing. "The applications are staggering," she said finally, her lawyer mind working through possibilities. "Treatment for depression, PTSD, anxiety disorders. You could help millions of people, but the potential for abuse is just as vast. Imagine if a government got hold of this technology, or a corporation that wanted to manipulate consumer behavior." "That's exactly why William kept it secret," Martha said, "and why he was so careful about who he trusted with knowledge of its existence." Sarah turned to Ben, her expression serious. "And you're planning to continue his work, to take on that kind of responsibility?" "Someone has to," Ben said. "There are people out there who need this kind of healing, people conventional medicine can't help." If we don't protect and develop this technology responsibly, it might be lost forever. Or someone less scrupulous might steal it and use it for their own purposes, Sarah added. Through the empathic field, Ben could sense her lawyer instincts, engaging, her mind already working through the legal and ethical complexities involved. Lila appeared at the workshop entrance, carrying a glass of lemonade and looking slightly disappointed. "Did you show Mommy everything already? I wanted to be here when she saw the heart machine light up." Sarah knelt down to accept the lemonade, her expression softening as she looked at their daughter. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. All of it. But Mommy needs to understand something. Are you and Daddy planning to stay here? Is this going to be your new home?" Lila looked at Ben, then back at her mother. "We have to stay, Mommy. The machines need someone from the family to take care of them, and Daddy and I are good at it. Besides, I like it here. I feel like I belong." The care. Simple honesty of her words hit both adults like a physical blow. Through the empathic field, Ben could feel Sarah's internal struggle, her desire to take Lila back to the familiar world of schedules and normalcy, warring with her growing recognition that their daughter was genuinely thriving in this strange new environment. "Sarah," Ben said quietly, "I know this isn't what you imagined for us, for any of us, but Lila's right. We do belong here. This work, this responsibility, it's what I was meant to do, what we were meant to do, if you're willing." "If I'm willing." "To what?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew what he was asking. "To help us," Martha said simply. "William's work needs protection. Legal protection, institutional protection, the kind of safeguards that only someone with your expertise could provide. The technology is advancing faster than one person can manage alone. We need someone who understands how to navigate the complex legal and ethical issues involved." Sarah stood slowly, looking around the workshop with new eyes. "You're asking me to give up my career, my life in the city, everything I've built to help protect something that most people would dismiss as impossible. I'm asking you to help us build something better," Ben said. "Something that could heal divisions that seem permanent, that could help people connect with each other in ways we've forgotten how to achieve." Through the empathic field, he could feel Sarah's resistance wavering, her practical mind recognizing the importance of what they were offering her. But he could also sense her fear of change, fear of leaving behind the security of the known world. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is too big, too important to decide impulsively." "Of course," Martha said. "But while you're thinking, perhaps you'd like to see one more thing, something that might help you understand the full scope of what William envisioned." She led them to a section of the workshop Ben hadn't explored yet, where a collection of crystalline nodes sat arranged in a complex geometric pattern. Each node was connected to the others by hair-thin filaments of light, creating a three-dimensional map that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. "The Community Connector Network," Martha explained. 17 active nodes, each one representing a person William helped over the years. People who proved themselves worthy of trust, who understood the responsibility that comes with this kind of power. She activated a control that made the network visualization expand, showing connections that stretched far beyond the immediate region. This is what he was building toward, a healing network that could span continents, connecting people who shared his vision of emotional and spiritual healing. As they watched, new points of light began appearing on the map, potential connections, people whose emotional wounds had brought them to the attention of the empathic field. Some were close, within a few hundred miles. Others were scattered across the globe, isolated pinpoints of need in a vast ocean of human suffering. "How many people could this help?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eventually, everyone," Martha said simply. "William believed that if enough people learned to use these technologies responsibly, if the network grew large enough and stable enough, it could fundamentally change how humanity deals with conflict, trauma, and emotional suffering." Sarah stared at the expanding map, and through the empathic field, Ben could feel her worldview reshaping itself to accommodate possibilities she'd never imagined. "What would you need from me?" she asked finally. "Legally, I mean. What kind of protection would this work require?" Ben felt hope bloom in his chest, warm and bright as sunlight. She was considering it. Despite everything, the impossibility, the risk, the complete upheaval it would mean for their lives, she was actually considering joining them in protecting his grandfather's legacy. It was Martha who found the hidden chamber 3 days after Sarah's visit, though she insisted later that it had found her. She'd been working alone in the workshop, calibrating the community connector nodes for what would be their first full network test, when one of the crystalline formations began resonating at a frequency she'd never heard before. The sound was barely audible, more of a vibration felt in the bones than heard with the ears, but it drew her attention to a section of the workshop wall that had always appeared solid. Following the resonance like a beacon, she pressed her hand against the stone and felt it give way, revealing a passage that led deeper into the mountain than she'd known was possible. Ben and Lila found her there an hour later, standing in a chamber that made the workshop above seem like a mere anteroom. The space was vast, carved from living rock with the same precision that characterized all of William's work, but this felt older somehow, ancient, as if the mountain itself had been shaped to accommodate secrets that predated human civilization. "How long has this been here?" Ben whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the crystalline acoustics of the chamber. "Since before your grandfather came to this mountain," Martha replied, her own voice filled with awe. "Look at the walls, Ben. Really look at them." The chamber walls were covered with diagrams, equations, and notations that clearly showed the evolution of William's work over decades. But as Ben's eyes adjusted to the strange, sourceless light that seemed to emanate from the crystals themselves, he realized that not all of the writing was in his grandfather's hand. Some of it was much older. Carved directly into the stone were symbols and mathematical formulas that looked like they'd been there for centuries. Other sections showed multiple handwritings, his grandfather's careful script layered over older notations, as if William had been continuing work that someone else had started long before. He wasn't the first, Ben breathed, understanding flooding through him. The empathic technology, the healing devices, my grandfather didn't invent them, he discovered them. Martha nodded, moving toward what appeared to be a control center carved into the far wall. "This is what William could never tell anyone, not even me, until near the end. He wasn't just a brilliant inventor working alone in the mountains. He was a guardian, protecting knowledge that had been hidden here for generations. The control center was unlike anything in the workshop above. Where William's devices were precise and mechanical, this technology seemed organic, grown rather than built. Crystalline formations pulsed with their own light, connected by networks of what looked like fossilized neural pathways spreading throughout the chamber walls, and at the center of it all, suspended in a matrix of light and crystal that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Ben's eyes could quite process, was the master blueprint. It wasn't a document in any conventional sense. Instead, it was a three-dimensional representation of the empathic network as William had envisioned it at full development, not just connecting the 17 people Martha had mentioned, but linking thousands, then millions, then potentially every human being on the planet. But this vision went far beyond anything Ben had imagined possible. The master blueprint showed the empathic field not just as a tool for healing emotional wounds, but as a bridge between individual consciousness and something larger. A network that could allow humanity to transcend the isolation that had defined the species since the beginning of recorded history. "Collective consciousness," Lila said quietly, reading from one of the wall inscriptions with the confidence of someone who'd been studying advanced concepts for weeks. Grandpa Great wasn't just trying to help people feel better. He was trying to help them become something new. Ben stared at his daughter, realizing that she understood implications that his adult mind was still struggling to process. Knew how? Connected, she said simply. Really connected. Not just knowing that other people exist, but feeling what they feel, understanding what they understand. Like being one big family instead of lots of separate people who don't know how to talk to each other. Martha activated something at the control center, and the master blueprint began to move, showing the progression of the network over time. Ben watched in fascination as the empathic connections spread across a map of the world, linking individuals, then communities, then entire regions in a web of shared emotional experience. The ancient knowledge holders called it the Great Joining, Martha explained. They believed that human consciousness was meant to evolve beyond individual isolation, that the next step in our development as a species would be learning to share, experience directly, emotionally, spiritually. But if this technology has existed for centuries, Ben asked, why hasn't it been used? Why did my grandfather have to rediscover it? Martha's expression grew somber, because every previous attempt to implement it was corrupted. People who sought power instead of healing, who wanted to control the network rather than serve it. The Guardians learned that the technology could only be safely used by those who had no desire to use it for personal gain. She gestured to additional inscriptions on the walls, these in languages Ben couldn't even identify. The knowledge was hidden, passed down through careful selection from guardian to guardian, waiting for a time when humanity might be ready to use it responsibly. And my grandfather thought the time was now? He thought the time was coming, Martha corrected. William believed that the increasing isolation and emotional dysfunction in modern society was actually a symptom of our readiness to evolve beyond individual consciousness. That the pain of separation was becoming so acute that people would finally be willing to risk connection. Ben thought about his own isolation after the divorce, the way he'd felt cut off not just from Sarah, but from any meaningful human connection. About Rebecca Morrison's grief and all the other people suffering from emotional wounds that conventional medicine couldn't touch. Maybe Martha was right. Maybe the pain of separation had become unbearable enough that people were finally ready to try something different. But there's something else, Martha continued, her tone becoming urgent. Something William discovered in his final years that changed everything he thought he knew about the network. She led them to a section of the chamber where the crystalline formations were darker, their light subdued and somehow ominous. The inscriptions here were all in William's handwriting, but the words were hurried, desperate, as if he'd been racing against time to record crucial information. The empathic field isn't empty, Ben read aloud. It's inhabited. Martha nodded grimly. William discovered that consciousness, human consciousness, doesn't disappear when the body dies. It persists in the empathic field, and some of those persistent consciousnesses have been there for a very long time. The implications hit Ben like a physical blow. You're saying the network doesn't just connect living people. It connects us to everyone who ever lived and achieved sufficient empathic development to survive death, Martha finished. William called them the ancestors, consciousnesses that had transcended physical existence but remained active, in the empathic field, watching, waiting, sometimes trying to influence events in the physical world. Lila had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up with the matter-of-fact tone that always surprised adults. That's why the machines work so well for us, isn't it? Because Grandpa Great is still here, helping us understand how to use them. Martha's eyes widened as she looked at Lila with new understanding. You can sense him, William's consciousness. Sometimes, Lila said. When I'm working with the heart machine, I can feel him watching, feel him being happy that we're taking care of his work. He's not scary or anything, he just wants to make sure we do it right. Ben felt the world reshaping itself around him once again. His grandfather wasn't just dead and gone. Some part of him remained active in the empathic field, accessible through the very devices he'd spent his life perfecting. Is that why you never told me about this chamber? He asked Martha. Because you weren't sure I was ready to know that my grandfather was still somehow present? Partly, Martha admitted, but also because William made me promise to wait until you discovered the chamber on your own, or until circumstances forced the revelation. He said that anyone who wasn't ready to find this place naturally wouldn't be ready to handle what's in it. She moved to the master blueprint, adjusting its display to show a different aspect of the network. Because the full empathic network doesn't just connect the living to each other, it connects the living to the ancestors. And some of those ancestors have very different ideas about how the network should be used. The display shifted, showing pockets of darkness within the empathic field, areas where consciousnesses that had been human once, but had become something else over centuries of existence in the field, were actively working to corrupt or control any attempt to expand the network. William called them the corrupted, Martha explained, consciousnesses that had achieved survival after death, but had been twisted by centuries of isolation and resentment. They see the expansion of the empathic network as an opportunity to regain influence in the physical world, to manipulate living humans for their own purposes. Ben stared at the display, understanding dawning slowly and terribly. And activating the full network would give them access to every connected consciousness. They could potentially influence or control millions of people. Which is why the network has to be activated carefully, with specific safeguards in place, Martha said. William spent the last 10 years of his life developing protection protocols, ways to filter out corrupted influence while allowing beneficial guidance from benevolent ancestors. She indicated a series of devices Ben hadn't noticed before, crystalline formations that seemed designed to analyze and sort different types of consciousness within the empathic field. But those safeguards have never been tested on the scale that full network activation would require, Martha continued, and there are indications that the corrupted have been growing stronger, more organized, as they sense the network approaching. Readiness for global expansion. So what do we do? Ben asked. How do we protect people from something they can't even perceive? The answer came not from Martha, but from Lila, her young voice carrying a certainty that seemed to come from beyond her years. We trust Grandpa Great, she said simply, and we trust each other. The bad ones can only hurt people who are afraid or angry or sad. But if we stay connected to love and to helping others, they can't touch us. Ben looked at his daughter, realizing that she understood the situation more clearly than either of the adults. The empathic network was indeed dangerous, but not using it was even more dangerous, because it would leave humanity isolated and vulnerable to the corrupted influence that was already seeping into the world through other means. The only way forward was to activate the network with full awareness of its risks, trusting in the safeguards William had developed, and in the guidance of benevolent ancestors like his grandfather. But first, they had to survive the attempts by both living and corrupted forces to stop them from completing William's work. The legacy key revealed itself 3 days before the full moon, emerging from the master blueprint's crystalline matrix, like something grown rather than made. Ben had been working in the hidden chamber for hours, trying to understand the activation sequence William had designed for the global network, when the blueprint suddenly pulsed and extruded what could only be described as a living key. It was roughly the size and shape of an old-fashioned skeleton key, but crafted from the same organic, crystal material as the ancestor filtration devices. More importantly, it felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse in rhythm with Ben's heartbeat when he held it. It's responding to your genetic signature, Martha explained, studying the key with the fascination of someone who'd spent decades working with William's technologies but had never seen this particular device activate. William built safeguards into the most sensitive technologies. Only direct family members can fully access the network's core functions. Ben turned the key over in his hands, feeling its weight and warmth. Through the empathic pendant around his neck, He could sense its purpose with startling clarity. This wasn't just a key to activate machinery, it was a genetic lock that would bind him permanently to the network, making him responsible for its protection and proper function for the rest of his life and beyond. "Once I use this, there's no going back," he said, though it wasn't really a question. "No," Martha confirmed. "The legacy key doesn't just activate the global network, it makes you part of it at the deepest level. Your consciousness becomes integrated with the system in a way that survives even physical death. You become one of the ancestors, charged with guiding and protecting future generations." Lila looked up from where she'd been studying the wall inscriptions, her face serious but unafraid. "That's why Grandpa Great could wait for us, isn't it? Because he used the key before he died, so part of him stayed connected to help us learn." The truth of her words resonated through the chamber, and Ben felt a presence he was beginning to recognize, his grandfather's consciousness still active in the empathic field, still watching over the work he'd dedicated his life to protecting. But they weren't the only ones aware of the key's emergence. The attack came at dawn, not with violence, but with something far more insidious. Ben woke to find Lila standing motionless beside her bed, her eyes open but unfocused, her breathing shallow and irregular. When he touched her shoulder, she didn't respond, not to his voice, not to gentle shaking, not even when he called her name with growing desperation. Through the empathic pendant, he could sense what was happening. Corrupted consciousnesses from the field had somehow bypassed the workshop's protections and were attempting to possess his daughter, using her natural sensitivity to the empathic field as an entry point. "Martha," he called, lifting Lila's unresponsive form and carrying her toward the workshop. "Something's wrong. They're inside her head." Martha met them at the hidden entrance, her face grim but unsurprised. "I felt them probing the defenses. All night," she said, leading them quickly to the main empathy engine. "They know we're close to activation. They're making their move." The mechanical heart was pulsing erratically, its usual steady rhythm disrupted by whatever was happening to Lila. As Ben set her down beside the device, he could see her body fighting against the invasion, small tremors that spoke of a consciousness. "Under siege. What do we do?" Ben asked, fighting down panic. "How do we get them out?" "We don't," Martha said, activating emergency protocols Ben hadn't known existed. "Lila has to do it herself. The corrupted can only maintain possession as long as she's afraid or isolated. But if she can remember her connection to love, to family, to purpose, they'll lose their hold automatically." Through the pendant, Ben could sense the battle raging inside his daughter's mind. The corrupted were trying to convince her that she was alone, that her father had abandoned her, that the work they were doing was dangerous and wrong. They fed on doubt and fear, growing stronger with every moment of despair they could generate. But Lila was stronger than they'd anticipated. Even as the corrupted whispered lies about abandonment and failure, Ben could feel his daughter's consciousness, fighting back, drawing strength from memories of working together in the workshop, of the joy she'd felt when she first touched the empathy engine, of the certainty that they were part of something larger and more important than themselves. Slowly, her breathing steadied. The tremors stopped, and when her eyes opened, they were clear and focused and entirely her own. "They're scared," she said simply, sitting up and looking around the workshop as if nothing unusual had happened. "The mean ones in the field. They're scared because they know what we're going to do will make it so they can't hurt people anymore." Ben pulled her into a fierce hug, relief flooding through him. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "They tried to make me feel alone," Lila said. "But I remembered that Grandpa Great is watching, and you're here, and Martha's here, and all the people wearing the special necklaces are connected to us. So I wasn't really alone at all." Martha's expression was troubled despite Lila's recovery. "The fact that they could penetrate our defenses at all means they're more organized than William believed possible. And if they're willing to attack a child directly, they'll stop at nothing to prevent network activation." As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles came from outside, multiple engines moving fast and with purpose. Ben climbed to the cabin level and peered through the windows to see a convoy of black SUVs pulling into the clearing, disgorging men and women in business suits who moved with the precision of military operatives. "Government?" he called down to Martha. "Worse," she replied grimly. "Corporate. I recognize the vehicles. They belong to Nexus Dynamics, a private research firm that's been hunting for William's work for years." Through the empathic field, Ben could sense the emotional signatures of the people surrounding the cabin. Cold, calculation, predatory excitement, and underneath it all, the telltale resonance of corrupted influence. These weren't just corporate raiders. They were people who'd been touched by the dark consciousnesses in the empathic field, manipulated into serving purposes they probably didn't even understand. "Dr. Walker," a woman's voice called from outside, amplified by some kind of speaker system. "Sissy, this is Dr. Elena Vasquez from Nexus Dynamics. We know you're in there and we know what you've discovered. We're prepared to offer you substantial compensation for your cooperation." Ben looked at Martha and Lila, seeing his own determination reflected in their faces. They'd come too far and learned too much to surrender William's legacy to people who would twist it for profit and control. "We need to activate the network now," he said, "while we still can." Martha nodded, already moving toward the passage to the hidden chamber. "The full activation sequence takes 12 hours. If we start now, we might be able to complete it before they find a way inside." But as they descended to the chamber where the master blueprint waited, Ben realized they weren't going to have 12 hours. Through the empathic field, he could sense more corrupted consciousnesses gathering, drawn by the impending activation like sharks to blood in the water. And above them, the Nexus Dynamics team was already probing the cabin's defenses, looking for ways to access the workshop. "Dr. Walker," the voice called again, closer now, "we know about the empathic technology. We know about the network connections. You can either work with us voluntarily, or we'll be forced to take more direct measures to secure the research." The threat was clear, and Ben felt anger flaring in his chest, not just at the people outside, but at the corrupted consciousnesses that were using them. These technologies were meant to heal, to connect, to help humanity transcend its isolation and fear. To see them threatened by forces that wanted only to exploit and control felt like a violation of everything his grandfather had worked to protect. But anger wasn't going to save them. Only the network itself could do that. Ben approached the master. Blueprint's control center, the legacy key warm in his hand. Around him, the chamber hummed with increasing energy as Martha began the preliminary activation sequence. The crystalline formations pulsed in complex patterns, and Ben could feel consciousnesses throughout the empathic field responding to the call. Not just the 17 people William had connected over the years, but others. Hundreds of them, people who'd been touched by the healing technologies and were now ready to join something larger than themselves. "Daddy," Lila said softly, taking his free hand, "Grandpa Great says to tell you that the key isn't just for starting the network, it's for protecting it. Once you use it, the bad ones won't be able to hurt the network anymore, because you'll be part of it forever." Ben looked down at his daughter, understanding finally dawning. The legacy key wasn't just about accepting responsibility for the network's protection. It was about becoming a permanent guardian, a living firewall between the healing technology and those who would corrupt it. Above them, the sound of forced entry echoed through the cabin. Nexus Dynamics had grown tired of negotiation. "Are you ready?" Martha asked, her hands poised over the final activation controls. Ben looked around the chamber one last time, at the ancient knowledge carved into the walls, at the impossible technologies his grandfather had spent his life perfecting, at Lila's trusting face and Martha's determined expression. Through the empathic field, he could sense Rebecca Morrison and the 16 others, all of them lending their strength and support to what was about to happen. And deeper in the field, he could feel his grandfather's presence, patient and proud, and ready to welcome him into a responsibility that transcended individual existence. Ben raised the legacy key toward the master blueprint's central receptor, knowing that the moment he inserted it, his life would change forever. Not just his life, potentially the course of human consciousness itself. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it completely. The sounds of the approaching intruders faded to insignificance as Ben focused on the key in his hand and the impossible, wonderful, terrifying future it represented. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face, humanity was about to take its next evolutionary step. And Ben Walker, failed architect and struggling single father, was going to be the one to help them take it. The moment Ben inserted the legacy key into the master blueprint's central receptor, the entire mountain seemed to wake up. Light erupted from the crystalline networks, not the gentle glow they'd grown accustomed to, but brilliant cascades of energy that made the chamber. Walls transparent, revealing the full extent of what his grandfather had built. The empathic field itself became visible. Streams of light connecting every living thing for miles around, pulsing with the rhythms of heartbeats and breathing and the deeper cadences of consciousness itself. Ben felt the change immediately. The key didn't just activate the network. It integrated his consciousness directly into its core systems. Suddenly, he could sense not just the 17 connected people Martha had mentioned, but thousands of others across the globe, all of them touched by empathic healing in some way, all of them ready to join something larger than individual existence. But he could also sense the corrupted, their dark influence spreading like infection through the field, trying to corrupt the new connections as they formed. "Ben!" Martha called over the rising hum of activation energy. "The transformation chamber, you need to get there now." She pointed toward an opening that hadn't existed moments before, revealed by the shifting of crystal formations as the chamber reconfigured itself for full network operation. Beyond the opening, Ben could see a space that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his eyes could process, where streams of empathic energy converged into something that looked like the heart of consciousness itself. "What about you and Lila?" he asked, even as he felt the network pulling at his awareness, demanding his presence at its center. "We'll hold the perimeter," Martha replied, her hands moving across control surfaces that were reshaping themselves in response to the activation. "But the transformation chamber can only be operated by someone wearing the legacy key. That's you now, Ben. That's your responsibility." Above them, the sounds of intrusion were getting closer. The Nexus Dynamics team had breached the cabin and was searching for the workshop entrance. But they were moving slowly, cautiously, as if the very air around them had become thick and resistant. Through his expanded awareness, Ben could sense what was happening. The activation was creating a field of intense empathic energy around the mountain, and anyone not prepared for it was being overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of connection it generated. The corporate operatives weren't just facing physical barriers, they were being forced to confront every emotion they'd ever suppressed, every connection they'd ever denied. Most of them had stopped moving entirely, paralyzed by the sudden awareness of how isolated and spiritually impoverished their lives had become. "Go," Lila urged, taking his hand and pulling him toward the transformation chamber. "Grandpa Great is showing me what to do. I can help Martha keep the mean ones away while you finish the work." Ben wanted to argue, to insist that an 8-year-old shouldn't be involved in something this dangerous. But through the network, he could sense his grandfather's presence more clearly than ever, and William's consciousness was indeed guiding. Lila, showing her how to operate defensive systems Ben hadn't even known existed. The transformation chamber was unlike anything in his previous experience. It wasn't really a room, so much as a nexus point, where the empathic field converged on itself, creating a space where individual consciousness could interface directly with the collective patterns of human experience. At its center stood a device, that looked like it had grown from the mountain itself, a pillar of living crystal that pulsed with the combined heartbeats of everyone connected to the network. As Ben approached it, he could feel his individual awareness beginning to merge with something vast and beautiful and completely beyond his ability to comprehend. Through the network, he could sense Rebecca Morrison in her house 20 miles away, tears of joy streaming down her face as she felt her isolation dissolving into profound connection. He could sense the other 16 guardians William had selected over the years, all of them lending their strength and experience to the growing web of empathic links. But he could also sense others, hundreds, then thousands of people around. The world who were suddenly aware that they weren't alone, that the empathic connections they'd always sensed but never trusted were real and available and healing. People in hospitals, discovering that their pain was diminished when shared with. Others who understood, families torn apart by conflict, feeling each other's love beneath the anger and misunderstanding. Individuals who'd believed themselves incapable of connection, suddenly aware of the vast community of consciousness that surrounded them. The network was working exactly as William had envisioned, but the corrupted weren't giving up without a fight. Through the expanding field, Ben could sense them marshalling their forces, ancient consciousnesses twisted by centuries of isolation and resentment, trying to corrupt the new connections as they formed. They couldn't attack the network directly, but they could influence the living people connected to it, feeding them doubt and fear and the old familiar lie that separation was safer than connection. Some of the new connections wavered, their owners pulling back from the intensity of shared experience. But for every person who retreated into isolation, 2 more stepped forward, drawn by the promise of healing they'd never believed possible. Ben placed his hands on the crystal pillar, feeling the legacy key respond to its proximity. The moment contact was made, his consciousness exploded outward, touching every connected mind simultaneously. He could feel their hopes, their fears, their desperate longing for connection and meaning, and through it all, he could sense his grandfather's presence, no longer just watching but actively participating. His consciousness merged with the network's core systems in a way that would guide and protect it long after Ben's own physical death. The harmony protocols, William's voice whispered through the field, not heard but directly understood. Remember what Martha taught you about filtering influence. The network must learn to distinguish between guidance and manipulation. Ben focused on the protocols Martha had shown him, the safeguards William had developed to protect connected minds from corrupted influence. But implementing them required more than just technical knowledge. It required emotional clarity, the ability to recognize the difference between love that sought to heal and power that sought to control. Through the network, he could feel Lila and Martha working frantically in the main chamber, operating defensive systems that were holding back both the corrupted consciousnesses and the Nexus Dynamics operatives. But their defenses were being tested to their limits. The corporate team had found the workshop entrance and was beginning to understand what they were looking at. Through their eyes, Ben could see their excitement at discovering technologies that could revolutionize everything from advertising to military applications. They saw the empathic devices not as tools for healing, but as weapons for influence and control. And that perception was exactly what the corrupted had been waiting for. Ben felt the attack the moment it began, not a direct assault on the network, but a subtle corruption of the operatives' intentions. The corrupted couldn't possess people who were strongly connected to love and purpose, but they could amplify existing greed and ambition until those emotions overwhelmed everything else. Through the network, he watched in horror as the lead operative, Dr. Elena Vasquez, began exhibiting the telltale signs of corrupted influence. Her movements became predatory, her expressions calculating in a way that spoke of intelligence that was no longer entirely human. She was heading directly for the chamber where Lila and Martha were making their last stand. The Harmony Stone revealed itself the moment Ben's desperation peaked. As Dr. Vasquez and her team breached the hidden chamber, where Martha and Lila were fighting to maintain the network's defenses, the crystal pillar in the transformation chamber split open like a flower, revealing a core of pure light that seemed to contain every positive emotion humanity had ever experienced. Through the network, Ben could feel what was happening above. Vasquez, now fully under corrupted influence, was advancing on Lila with movements that were no longer entirely human. The thing wearing her face had recognized that the child was key to the network's operation and was preparing to eliminate what it saw as a threat to its plans for corruption. But Lila wasn't defenseless. As Vasquez lunged forward, Lila placed her small hands on the main empathy engine and did something Ben hadn't known was possible. Instead of just connecting to the network, she became a conduit for it, channeling the combined love and protective instinct of everyone connected to the empathic field. The wave of pure, protective love that emanated from the engine hit Vasquez like a physical force, stopping her mid-stride and driving the corrupted consciousness from her mind so completely that she collapsed. Her own consciousness rushing back into a body that had been used by something ancient and malevolent. Through the network, Ben felt the corrupted recoil from the power Lila had accessed. They'd been expecting to face isolated individuals, people they could overwhelm through fear and despair. They hadn't anticipated encountering the full force of human love channeled through technologies designed to amplify positive emotions. The Harmony Stone pulsed in response to what was happening above, and Ben understood its purpose with crystal clarity. It wasn't just a component of the network. It was its emotional regulator, the device that would ensure empathic connections enhanced love and understanding rather than amplifying negative emotions. But using it required a choice that would define the network's character forever. Ben could attune the stone to maximum protection, creating filters so strong that only the most positive emotions could pass through the network. That would eliminate any possibility of corrupted influence, but it would also limit the network's healing potential. People struggling with depression, trauma, or grief would find their access restricted just when they needed help most, or he could set the filters more openly, allowing the full spectrum of human emotion to flow through the network, while trusting in the collective wisdom of connected consciousness to reject corrupted influence. It was riskier, but it would allow the network to help people in their darkest moments when healing was most desperately needed. Through the empathic field, he could sense the opinions of everyone connected to the network. Rebecca Morrison, remembering how the devices had helped her transform grief into gratitude. The other guardians William had selected over the years, all of them convinced that love was stronger than fear if given the chance to prove itself. And thousands of newcomers to the network, people whose lives had been touched by empathic healing and who were ready to trust in something larger than individual struggle. The vote was unanimous, though no formal vote had been taken. Everyone connected to the network understood instinctively that healing required risk, that connection could only happen when people were allowed to be vulnerable with each other. Ben attuned the Harmony Stone to maximum openness, trusting in the collective wisdom of human love to protect itself from corruption. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Every person connected to the network suddenly had access to the full emotional spectrum of everyone else, but filtered through the stone's harmonizing influence. Pain remained pain, but it was pain that could be shared and thereby diminished. Joy became amplified through multiple perspectives until it felt like sunlight made manifest, and love became a force of nature, connecting hearts across vast distances and dissolving barriers that had seemed permanent. In the chamber above, the remaining Nexus Dynamics operatives were experiencing the network's influence firsthand. Instead of seeing the empathic technologies as tools for control, they were beginning to understand them as instruments of healing. Several of them were weeping openly, overwhelmed by the sudden awareness of how isolated and spiritually impoverished their lives had become. Dr. Vasquez, freed from corrupted influence, was staring at Lila with an expression of awe and dawning understanding. "What have we done?" she whispered. "What were we trying to destroy?" "You weren't trying to destroy anything," Martha said gently, helping the disoriented woman to her feet. "You were being used by forces that want to prevent human consciousness from evolving beyond individual isolation. But that influence is broken now. You're free to choose what you really want." Through the network, Ben could sense the corrupted making one final attempt to corrupt the system. They poured their accumulated resentment and despair into the empathic field, trying to overwhelm the new connections with the spiritual poison they'd been cultivating for centuries. But the attack had exactly the opposite effect they'd intended. Instead of corrupting the network, their negativity was transformed by the Harmony Stone into fuel for even stronger connections. Every attempt to spread despair instead strengthened the bonds between connected consciousness. Every effort to promote isolation instead demonstrated the profound value of empathic connection. The corrupted found themselves faced with something they'd never encountered in centuries of existence. Love so strong and pure that it could transform even their ancient bitterness into healing energy. One by one, Ben felt them making an impossible choice. Instead of continuing their futile attacks on the network, they began to surrender their corrupted state, allowing the harmonizing influence to heal spiritual wounds that had festered for centuries beyond counting. They didn't disappear. Consciousness, once achieved, was apparently permanent. But they transformed, their accumulated resentment dissolving into gratitude for finally being offered a path back to connection and purpose. Through the network, Ben could sense his grandfather's joy at witnessing something William had only dared to hope for, not just the protection of human consciousness from corruption, but the healing of consciousnesses that had been corrupted for so long they'd forgotten what connection felt like. The transformation chamber filled with light as the network reached full activation. Ben felt his individual consciousness expanding until it touched every connected mind simultaneously, not erasing his identity, but integrating it into something vast and wonderful and completely beyond his previous understanding. He was still Ben Walker, still a father who loved his daughter and wanted to protect her future. But he was also part of a network of healing consciousness that spanned the globe, connected to thousands of people who were discovering that isolation was a choice, not an inevitability. Above him, he could sense Lila laughing with delight as she felt the network's joy flowing through her small hands. Martha was weeping with relief and triumph, knowing that William's vision had finally been realized. And throughout the empathic field, people were making connections they'd never believed possible. Heart to heart, mind to mind, consciousness to consciousness. The network was alive, and it was exactly what humanity needed to heal the wounds that individual effort alone could never touch. 6 months after the network's activation, Ben stood on the cabin's rebuilt porch, watching Lila tend to a garden that seemed to grow with supernatural vitality. The vegetables were larger and more vibrant than anything he'd seen before, and Martha insisted it was because plants, like people, responded to the empathic field's harmonizing influence. The cabin itself had been transformed. What had once been a derelict structure was now the coordinating center for a global network of healing consciousness that connected nearly 50,000 people across 6 continents. But more than that, it felt like home in a way Ben had never experienced before, not just for him and Lila, but for the steady stream of visitors who came seeking understanding of what they'd heard whispered about in medical circles and spiritual communities. Sarah emerged from the workshop, carrying the Guardian's journal he'd begun writing, her face showing the kind of peace Ben had never seen during their marriage. The divorce papers lay forgotten in a drawer somewhere, not because they'd gotten back together, but because the concepts of separation and union had taken on entirely new meanings in the context of empathic connection. The testimonials keep. "Coming," she said, settling beside him on the porch swing they'd built together. "Dr. Patterson from Johns Hopkins wants to document what happened with the trauma patients who've been connected to the network." "The recovery rates are—" She shook her head in amazement. "They're impossible by conventional standards." Ben nodded, feeling through the network the joy of a war veteran in Philadelphia whose nightmares had finally stopped, the relief of a mother in Tokyo whose autistic son had begun speaking after months of isolation, the gratitude of an elderly man in London whose depression had lifted for the first time in decades. The healing wasn't miraculous in the sense of defying natural law. It was miraculous in the sense of allowing natural law to operate as it was, meant to, with human consciousness, connected to the larger patterns of love and understanding that individual isolation obscured. "Any word from Dr. Vasquez?" Ben asked. Sarah smiled. "She's requesting funding to establish an official research center here. Nexus Dynamics has completely changed their focus. Instead of trying to weaponize empathic technology, they want to help develop medical applications. Elena says it's the most important work she's ever been involved in." Through the network, Ben could sense Vasquez in her laboratory in California, working with a team of researchers to develop portable versions of the healing devices. But more than that, he could feel her genuine commitment to ensuring the technology was used only for healing, her consciousness permanently transformed by her brief experience with corrupted influence. Martha appeared in the doorway, carrying a tea service and wearing the expression of someone who'd just received wonderful news. "The Kenyan delegation has agreed to establish a connection hub in Nairobi," she announced. "And the Aboriginal elders in Australia want to discuss how the network might complement their traditional healing practices." The expansion was happening faster than any of them had anticipated, but it was happening organically, person by person, heart by heart. Each new connection to the network created ripples that touched dozens of other lives, and those people reached out to dozens more until the empathic field was growing like a living thing. But it wasn't growing chaotically. The safeguards William had built into the system, enhanced by the Harmony Stone's filtering influence, ensured that only people ready for genuine connection could access the network's deeper levels. Those who approached it with purely selfish motives found themselves gently redirected toward more conventional forms of assistance. "Daddy," Lila called from the garden, "Grandpa Great wants to show you something." Ben made his way to where his daughter knelt among tomato plants that stood nearly as tall as she did. When he placed his hand on her shoulder, he immediately felt his grandfather's presence more clearly than usual, not just watching, but actively communicating through the empathic field. What William showed him was a vision of the future, not a certainty but a possibility that grew more likely with each passing day. He saw the network expanding until it connected not thousands but millions of people, all of them linked by bonds of empathic understanding that transcended national boundaries, racial divisions, and ideological conflicts. He saw medical centers, where physical healing was enhanced by empathic connection, where patients recovered faster because they weren't fighting their illnesses alone. He saw schools where children learned not just facts but empathy, where bullying became impossible because everyone could feel the pain it caused. He saw communities where disputes were resolved through shared understanding rather than adversarial conflict. Most importantly, he saw a world where mental illness, addiction, and the epidemic of isolation that plagued modern society became increasingly rare as people rediscovered their fundamental connection to each other and to something larger than individual existence. "How long until that becomes real?" Ben asked aloud, though he knew his grandfather couldn't answer directly. The response came not from William, but from the network itself, from the thousands of connected consciousness that were working every day to make that vision reality. There was no timeline, because there didn't need to be one. The transformation was already happening, one healed heart at a time, one restored connection at a moment. Ben opened the Guardian's journal to a fresh page and began to write, documenting not just the technical aspects of maintaining the network, but the deeper wisdom he was learning about consciousness, connection, and the healing power of shared experience. Future generations would need guidance for protecting and expanding what they'd built. More importantly, they'd need understanding of the responsibility that came with empathic power, the recognition that every use of the network's influence had to be motivated by love rather than control, by service rather than dominance. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ben felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of finished work, but the completion that came from finding his true purpose and accepting the responsibility it entailed. He was no longer the broken man who'd arrived at this mountain 6 months ago, fleeing from failure and loss. He was a guardian of humanity's next evolutionary step, a protector of technologies that could heal wounds conventional medicine couldn't touch, a bridge between individual consciousness and the collective wisdom that emerged when hearts connected. Across the artificial barriers of separation, Lila joined him on the porch, her small hand slipping into his as they watched the last light fade from the sky. Through the network, he could feel the gratitude of thousands of people whose lives had been transformed by empathic healing, the determination of researchers and healers working to expand the technology's applications, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that William's vision was becoming reality. "Are you happy, Daddy?" Lila asked, though her empathic sensitivity meant she already knew the answer. "I'm more than happy, sweetheart," Ben replied, pulling her close. "I'm home." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, each point of light reflecting the growing network of connected consciousness that was transforming human civilization one heart at a time. The work was far from finished, would never be finished really, as long as there were people who needed healing and connection. But it was begun, and it was good, and it would continue long after Ben's own consciousness joined his grandfather's. In the empathic field's permanent embrace, in the Guardian's journal, he wrote one final entry for the day. The healing of the world begins with the healing of individual hearts. But individual hearts heal fastest when they remember they were never meant to beat alone. The mountains settled into peaceful silence, its ancient stones holding secrets that were no longer hidden, its forests whispering with the voices of all, who had found healing in the connection that transformed isolation into love.